Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. We are very pleased to have this evening Elizabeth Shackelford, a former U.S. diplomat whose new book, The Dissent Channel, American Diplomacy in a Dishonest Age, is freshly out this spring. We are very pleased to have her here tonight. We will be discussing that. Gibson's events program is sustained by book sales, so if you were interested in the book, we have book plates are in the mail. Mail is a bit beleaguered right now, so book plates are on their way to us, signed book plates, which we will include with your purchases. And I will tuck a book purchase link in the chat. Our program is sustained by book sales. So I will do that station break a couple times tonight. We are recording this program so that if you have a friend that you think would have liked this program, you can send it to them later. We are very, very pleased to have you here tonight. Elizabeth, welcome to Gibson's Bookstore. How are you tonight? Tell me about your book.
I'm doing really well, and I'm excited to be here joining you guys this evening. So the book is about my experience. Primarily, the storyline is my experience as a diplomat in South Sudan when war broke out there in 2013. And in the middle of that storyline where I'm kind of using the examples of what I experienced in South Sudan, basically is teaching moments about what the problems are with our foreign policy overseas. So the reader kind of learns, as I learned as a young diplomat, in the moment of the mistakes that we make and the decisions that we make and the consequences of that. But you basically learn those parts of the book as you go along through what is really quite, at times harrowing, very exciting story that was a year that I spent in South Sudan and working on the policies after that.
So the book chronicles your experience as a Foreign Service officer representing the U.S. overseas. How did you come to join the Foreign Service, and when and how did you decide you wanted to be a diplomat? How does one become a diplomat?
Well, I've been doing a lot of work overseas in my kind of early and mid 20s. First I was working with NGOs, kind of non-governmental organizations, working on kind of human rights issues overseas. And then I was working with USAID implementing development programs, and mostly on legal issues, because I was a lawyer briefly. I'm a recovering lawyer, as many diplomats are, you'll find. But I had met a lot of other Foreign Service officers when I'd been traveling, both in work and for fun over a number of years. And so one day I thought, that seems like a really interesting career, and one where you can really contribute to something meaningful. The idea of being in service sounded really inspiring to me. So I went through the process. It's really kind of boring and mundane and laborious, but involves a written test and a bunch of exams, and then kind of a full day in person, kind of gaming interview writing process where you compete basically with other aspiring diplomats. And after all of this process, you kind of get ranked somewhere on the process of being able to get in, and then one day you get that letter saying that you're going to be in one of the upcoming classes. It's really exciting, and it was a very rewarding career, cut a little bit short though.
So you mentioned that a lot of lawyers like to become diplomats. Is that because you already have a familiarity with the legal system, or do you think it's because they want to start to turn to giving back? Is there a crossover in personality?
It's interesting. I have never quite pinned down why it is. Maybe it's because places like Washington, D.C. are full of attorneys and they look for ways to escape the Beltway. I'm not sure. But one of the similarities between being a diplomat and being a lawyer that I found is that you're kind of expected to be able to study up and kind of quickly become sufficiently familiar with a wide variety of things. As diplomats, we were called generalists. You were supposed to basically be able to pitch hit in any number of scenarios. So for one posting, one tour overseas. You might spend 2 years being a political officer, where you're tracking the political developments in a country and you're reporting back to Washington what, what the trends are, what the dangers are ahead, what programs and initiatives and efforts we should be supporting. And then the next tour, you might be a public affairs officer. So your job is basically to, kind of work on America's PR overseas. So very different jobs, which is one of the really appealing parts of the career.
Okay, so how did you end up in South Sudan? And did you have any impressions or expectations when you arrived?
So when I first joined the Foreign Service, as I mentioned, I did so kind of naively based on idealism about what the U.S. government was doing overseas. So, and I'd done a lot of work in Africa before, so I was quite interested in doing some more work on that continent. I joined the Foreign Service in 2010, and that was just the year before South Sudan was set to vote on a referendum to become independent and then become an independent country. And it just sounded like the perfect opportunity for an aspiring young idealistic diplomat, like new country, great opportunities. Look at all the good we can do here. I guess when I arrived, I realized this is not just a good news story of, independence and hope. Nation building is really, really hard. And frankly, none of us have figured it out yet.
All right. Well, this story gives your experiences in South Sudan before and during the outbreak of the civil war there. Can you explain a little bit about the country's history and what was happening when you arrived there in 2013?
Sure. Actually, I might take a minute to just read a short excerpt from the book that kind of describes both what was happening before I arrived and kind of what was in my head on arrival. So it starts out before I arrived. On July 9th, 2011, amid great jubilation and cheering crowds, unfazed by the baking sun beating down on the ceremony in the Garang Mausoleum in Juba, the flag of Sudan was lowered and the flag of this new nation raised, with bands of black, red, and green stretching out from a blue triangle on which was centered a yellow star. The black band represented the people. Indeed, the name Sudan, a term recorded since the 12th century, meant land of the black people. The red represented the blood shed by the Southerners in decades of war with Sudan. And the green, the country's lush landscape of grasslands, wetlands, and forests. The star stood for unity and sat on a blue background representing the mighty life-giving Nile. The flag's symbolism was strong and unifying, at least on that day. Dignitaries from around the world joined this important occasion, including Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and a large US delegation sat in the VIP area. US Ambassador to the UN Susan Rice headed up a group of Americans and delivered remarks to the overflowing crowd, welcoming the new country to the community of nations, and calling it a day of triumph for all who cherish the right of people everywhere to govern themselves in liberty and in law. She went on to say, "We remain mindful of the challenges that await us. No true friend would offer false comfort, but the Republic of South Sudan is being born amid great hopes, and hope that you will guarantee the rights of all citizens, shelter the vulnerable, and bring prosperity to all corners of your land." To great applause, she stated, "My government will stand with you. So long as you seek a more perfect union, you will never be alone." It all sounded just and right, and as though we, the United States, were ready to be the guarantors of this justness and rightness. With this much interest in the country's success, backed by nearly $700 million in aid each year, could this be a place where we could get it right? If not here, if not under these circumstances, could we ever? As I flew into South Sudan for the first time, just 2 years later, this was the question on my mind. My view from the plane was mostly blocked by the wing and propeller, but what I saw as we soared over the landscape of this new state looked lush, green, flat, and empty. This was what I had envisioned after all, a blank slate, but a fertile one, where democracy was only starting to take shape and the possibilities were endless. What I couldn't see from the cruising altitude were the many obstacles to progress already rooted in the dark, rich soil. So if that gives you a sense of the idea, it was all elation, it was all success, and I blindly went in thinking that I was going to be part of building up on this success. And within 6 months of my arrival, the very city that we were living in was littered with bodies.
So you speak to deep interest the U.S. government had in South Sudan. And can you tell us why that was, and why were you so involved in the independence movement?
So it was, I hadn't really been involved, but I'd been following it for a long time. It had been decades of war in Sudan. There had been two Sudanese civil wars over several decades, separated only by about, I believe it was 11 years of peace in the middle of that. And everyone had an interest, everyone who followed Africa had an interest in ending this longest running civil war on the continent. But it's really interesting to see kind of who the bedfellows were who pushed for this incredible focus on what is, generally speaking, not a very strategic part of the world for the United States. The evangelical movement had really adopted the idea of the Southern fight against oppression from the North in Sudan. So it had been adopted by a very strong evangelical movement for decades. And they kind of aligned up with the kind of human rights establishment that really wanted to push for a strong, for the rights of the Southerners. And so it became this very black and white, good versus evil story. Sudan were the oppressors in the North. They were Muslim, which of course, made them bigger boogeymen from kind of the U.S. establishment, particularly the evangelical side. And we had issues already with them with kind of terrorism matters long before 9/11. So it was something that gained interest in Congress, and lo and behold, it became a cause celeb, and frankly, actual celebrities got very involved in it as well. So it was just it was a pet project for a lot of different players in American politics, and that was why the United States became kind of known as the midwife for South Sudan's independence. And kind of that stunning day where they were all jubilant about their independence, it was basically like, okay, our job here is done. They're independent. They're going to have an election. We can tie a bow on it. But they had decades and decades of instability, of abuses against civilians of all kinds that they really never grappled with. And that's what I saw the costs of when I arrived there.
Okay, well, if the U.S. is the midwife in 2013, how is baby doing today? What is happening in South Sudan these days? Is it still at war?
So there is currently a transitional government of national unity, is what they call it. But this is more or less third time's the charm. And there's already a lot of kind of intercommunal violence going on. There are already conflicts between the different factions of the government. By and large, the war is not over. It has just paused. And what we're seeing now is similar to what we saw in 2014 when you had an initial peace agreement, 2016 when you had an initial transitional government. And basically, we're going into, at this stage, we're in 6 years of war. There's still a lot of violence going on, and there is no stable peace. So long story short is, I'm not optimistic that where they are right now is going to be for the long haul. And a large number of them are currently positive with coronavirus. So the question is, what happens when you're in the middle of a peace effort and half of that peace effort gets coronavirus? We don't know yet. We don't know if they will get through it. We don't know how that might impact what people believe about the peace efforts. So, watch this space. It's not likely to be pretty.
Do we have any records from any other, not related to South Sudan specifically, but do we have any history examples from, say, the 1918 flu pandemic of how one is a diplomat during a pandemic? Can we look back on how do you continue peacekeeping efforts during a pandemic? This degree did not prepare me for this, I will say.
I don't think it prepared anyone for it, because I mean, of course, this pandemic is so different because the world is so connected. But what do you do with peacekeeping efforts? A lot of these countries, it's a fascinating thing to look into because so many countries in the world first received coronavirus on planes from people from the West, from Europe or the United States, and that's become a real challenge because that makes them, of course, kind of the boogeymen, which for those who do read the book, we have I have an entire chapter on how the government, in its frustration with the bad press that it was getting and some pressure from the international community to stop its bad acts, began lashing out at the UN and the Americans and trying to redirect people's anger and angst to another force. And I think that a scenario like this really lays the groundwork for the government to do that again, to blame peacekeepers for bringing in a disease and the challenges that they're facing.
Xenophobia is definitely going to see a big uptick right now. This is okay. Yikes. So at the outset of the book, you're describing your arrival in the country and how the history and present were not added up. And what did you mean by not adding up?
So when I arrived, it was really still in the wake of this excitement over a new country and all of the opportunity and potential it had. The week before I arrived was the second anniversary of South Sudan's birth. And, I read a lot of commentary. I read the speech or the statement that Secretary John Kerry gave on the occasion. And of course, this was still something that the American government was relaying as a great success story. And it didn't take a long time being on the ground to realize that just wasn't what the situation looked like from the inside. Just that very same week, or maybe the week after, President Salva Kiir sacked his entire cabinet, which essentially included a lot of people that seemed to threaten him and his political position in what was supposed to be an incoming election cycle that had not really been set yet. But we see this all over. Nobody wants to empower the people who are going to be their competition, whether political competition or otherwise. But I had heard all these great stories when I was back in Washington and in training before I came out. And then on arrival, it just looked like it was unraveling rapidly.
So I'm going to take a moment here for a station break. You are watching Elizabeth Shackelford, author of the Dissent channel with Gibson's Bookstore Remote Events Program. Our events program is sustained by book sales, so if you would like a copy of the book, we'd be happy to ship one to you. We do have book plates on their way, which we will happily include with an order. If you want to contribute in a different way, we are also available for donations on a pay what you can basis for the content of this program. But let us return to the Dissent channel. Switching a little bit here, you are best known for your vocal resignation from the State Department under the Trump administration, but this book takes place mostly during the prior administration. Why didn't you resign sooner over your frustrations with the policies you saw play out in South Sudan?
I think it is really important for me in getting this book out that people understand that while issues like challenges to the State Department and our federal government right now are definitely front and center in the news, and people are paying a lot more attention to challenges with our foreign policy and our role in the world, and whether President Trump or the Secretary of State Pompeo are really damaging our reputation. But the problems with our foreign policy have been really rooted over decades of drift away from a focus on diplomacy and really into a space of using a lot more kind of military first approach. We haven't been really engaging on with our partners and others in the world to address major challenges. But I didn't resign, even though I had spent several years questioning what we were doing, most specifically on South Sudan. And I didn't because I felt that even though I disagreed with a lot of what we were doing, I still felt like the leadership of the State Department and that the administration had the same goals that I had. I might disagree with our approach to how to reach it. But I did feel like the ultimate purpose of what we were trying to do was all on the same page. I felt that if I could work my way up through the system, I could find a way to be more influential and help shape what we do as I got more senior. So I was ready. I was ready to wait for that. I was ready to work my way up. But after it had been a year since Donald Trump was elected president, and just watching the shift and the change and what our very goals were, I didn't feel like this administration was really working towards a kind of a more prosperous and stable world through our influence. I thought that a lot of what we were doing was dangerous. So I decided at that point that I didn't want to accidentally find myself reinforcing dangerous approaches and dangerous policies. So I felt that I needed to leave.
So you mentioned that there were methods that you disagreed with, even though the goals used to be similar. So you do speak in the book about your disappointment that the U.S. government didn't do more to address violence in South Sudan. Do you want to talk about some? I don't know how far obviously I don't have any clearance, and probably nobody in this Zoom webinar does, but what do you think should have been done instead if we go back to maybe some methodology?
One of the big themes in the book, and one of the themes for me personally, is that we're not going to be able to, as a country, end every war and make every government that we work with respect human rights and do the right thing. But we certainly should use the tools in our toolbox and our influence, which we do have tremendous influence. We should be using it to promote long-term stability and long-term prosperity around the world, because that's in our national interest as well. What I find with a lot of our approach over the past few decades, and probably well beyond that, is that it's very short-sighted, it's very short-term. So for example, you look at what you can do in the short presidential election cycle that we have, and it's not a lot in the big scheme of things. So oftentimes it becomes, how do you keep this place stable? You keep this place stable by continuing to support the government that we have been supporting. In the case of South Sudan, that was Salva Kiir's government, and our support for him in the first several years of the war really legitimized him and helped him tremendously, even just from the currency of our support. I'm not sure that at which stage, if we had changed our tune and been less supportive, which we are now, what would have made a big difference in terms of the length of the war. But short-term stability, which often involves propping up really autocratic regimes, doesn't make for long-term stability. And I think we need to be looking out a lot more into the future.
So how do these challenges and problems that you saw in South Sudan relate to what's going on with U.S. foreign policy today?
Yeah, I feel as though, and I referenced this earlier in terms of these problems that we're seeing today didn't start today. I like to describe the current administration as having taken the shortcomings and the short-sightedness of our foreign policy, and frankly our domestic policy in many cases, and they basically just put our mistakes into overdrive. They've completely taken the governor off of the acceleration, and the issues that we've had, like our kind of tendency to turn to military solutions first, our tendency to lead with kind of stabilizing and following the inertia of whoever we've been supporting in the past. Those things are really moving ahead, whereas our tendency to kind of give short shrift to issues like accountability and human rights and the rule of law, we have for a long time given those less consideration than they merit. And so that has laid the groundwork for the fact that this administration gives them no merit at all. So I feel as though we have slipped slowly and slowly, really since the September 11th attacks. It's gotten worse and worse and worse on the militarization. But but none of the issues we're seeing are new. And I think that people need to realize that, particularly going into, an election cycle. It won't be enough to improve our foreign policy and our position in the world just to go back to where we were a few years ago. It's important to recognize that this administration has done damage to our influence around the globe, but it's not going to be enough just to go back to status quo ante.
So you chose to leave the US government based on your experience with speaking truth to power. What advice do you have for civil servants still working in the government today?
To start with, in the current pandemic situation we're all in, I have tremendous respect for the people who continue to do these jobs. I resigned and I felt that I needed to, but I by no means think that everyone should walk out the door. It would be a massive crisis if that happened. I hope maybe what people are realizing, but both from our national government, but even more so from our state governments these days, is the real value that government has and what it can bring, particularly in crisis situations like this. But my advice to people who are still on the inside is to make sure that they're constantly evaluating whether the role that they're in puts them in a position where they can do more good than harm. And I think that that is a question people need to ask themselves, in the government today at every level. This isn't, it isn't a partisan issue. It's a matter of where the values are of the current government and where the priorities are. And if you feel like you're in a position, and most of these civil servants have been in their positions for many, many years, if you feel as though you are able to do the good and important work that you do, whether that's at the CDC or with the State Department helping Americans get back home who've been stranded in other countries, or or doing research with different kind of science-based organizations, a lot of them are still able to do really critical work. But even kind of worker bees like I was in the State Department can find themselves contributing to policies that do damage to what we're supposed to be doing for the American people.
Is there so doctors have a Hippocratic oath to do no harm. Is there any kind of analogy to that in diplomacy? I'm not very, I mean, would there be? That's your goal, just do no harm?
I mean, that's a great way to put the question. I think that our most basic goal should be do no harm. What is fascinating is that, humanitarians often, that's kind of an edict of international humanitarian work, is you have to look at what the kind of second and third knockoff effects of what you're doing. When you, let's say, for example, you land in a place where there's a famine and you're trying to feed a lot of people. Are you, by who you are feeding or who you are hiring to help distribute food, are you accidentally or unknowingly reinforcing some kind of clan-based dynamic that might cause some people to suffer and kind of change the power structure? Those are the types of real complicated issues that you're dealing with. The short answer is, do we have something like that specifically in diplomacy? No, and it seems like it should go without saying that your baseline is don't screw things up worse. But it seems as though that's not always the first question we ask. I think another challenge that I would see for the next administration, generally speaking, is going to be what things that are kind of norms or assumptions do we need to pass into law or regulation and just state out explicitly so that people don't do it. One should be, we should have better protections for, inspectors general, as we saw over the last couple of weeks, if people have been following the news on that. There's been an assault on oversight. But it goes for things that are just as simple as this idea of make sure what you're doing is not making things worse. And I think that gets back to the short-term view we have in our foreign policy. Because if you're not looking ahead to say, what are the knock-on effects several years down the road? If you're only looking to think, how does this make us look in the next 2 years before there's another election? for example. I'm not saying that ever happens, but you know, if it did, I think it's useful to spell it out. And if you can't be certain that the outcome won't be worse, then you know those are the times that we should wonder about what we should be doing in terms of our interventions and engagements around the world.
That sounds exhausting. Trying to do short-term good, but it's almost a butterfly effect of,
Yeah.
that's exhausting. I choose to run events at a bookstore. That's a lot of pressure. So let's move along here. What advice do you have for young people considering a career in foreign affairs or just generally with the government?
You know, I really hope that people are still, you know, young people in particular are still looking at the Foreign Service as a really viable option. It's a great career and a really important one. I feel that, I mean, I know that the numbers of Foreign Service officers are down. There have been a lot of people have resigned, a lot of people have retired early, and the numbers of applicants for the Foreign Service officer test are down as well. And I've gotten a lot of questions from young people who consider it, wondering, you know, should I still apply? Should I still go forward? And I say absolutely. I mean, for a couple of very practical reasons. One is, you know, typically speaking, in your earliest stages, you're learning the ropes, you're doing kind of lower level activity. Ignore the fact that in my second tour, I was running evacuations in Juba. That's very it's very out of the ordinary. But you do have opportunities to do things that don't put you in a policy conundrum with, you know, should I or shouldn't I help implement something that maybe isn't the most beneficial to our foreign policy. So, you know, I would say forge ahead and do it. We need great people in the Foreign Service, and it's probably even easier to get in now than it used to be for anybody who thought they might not qualify. But I would also say, you know, and echoing what I said with my earlier comment on civil servants right now, I just think, and I think anybody in any institution should keep this always in the back of their mind, which is, you know, every day with what you do, are you able to continue, you know, fulfilling the reason that you got this job where it is, you know, what the purpose of that organization. If it's about something that's meaningful, then make sure that you're always working towards that end. And if you get to a point where you no longer feel that you can, you know, people need to remember that it's the job of the people who are on the inside to speak up and to speak out, to do that inside the organization at first and try and change things from the inside, as everyone should try to do. And if you can't do that ultimately, and you cannot avoid doing harm, then I think people need to always be ready to walk away if that's a risk.
So we have a comment here from attendee Murad, who says, it is admirable that you stood up for your core convictions. So you're living the life that Mr. Rogers says we should. So well done. We're gonna do one more question from my list, and then if any of you guys have questions that you'd like to submit, our chat box is open, and so is the Q&A. I am gonna ask you, what lessons did you take away from your experience writing a book on this subject?
It's a totally different, it was a different set of lessons from what I learned while I was working. But, you know, for starters, I learned that when you go through kind of secondary trauma situations, which witnessing and working through a war will do to you, I learned that, you know, I probably had some serious issues to work out. And it can be cathartic to write all of this down and kind of work your way through it. So it was an emotional time. And for those who read the book, you'll see there were many, many trials and tribulations throughout this. So while it was kind of painful to live through it again, it was also cathartic. But I will say that through both the resignation process and the process of writing and working on this book, what I learned was that I had spent my lifetime kind of thinking that I had a role to play, but I didn't necessarily think that people would, you know, think that a general public audience would listen to that. And what I've learned is that when you have a unique experience and you are willing to step up and talk about it, there is an audience for that. There are people who want to listen. So, I would encourage people who, feel strongly about things. Maybe it's not write a book, but, write letters to your senators and representatives, write letters to the editor. Think about how your specific situation informs an issue that you feel strongly about, because we all have unique perspectives, and write it down and share it with your friends and family. Because what I learned in this process was that, I felt very strongly about the issues, and I wanted to share it, and people wanted to hear it. So I would encourage people to keep that in mind. I mean, what we're learning and what we've learned over the past few years is that, our voices really do matter. And I think we all have a role to play.
So our station break here. This is Gibson's Bookstore event program remote with author Elizabeth Shackelford with her book Dissent channel. Gibson's events program is sustained by book sales. So if you would like a copy of the book, we would be happy to send one to you with a signed book plate once those arrive in the mail. So we have our first question here from Janine. Do you think that Foreign Service employees ebb and flow due to an administration?
They typically don't. It's very rare when that does tend to happen, because when you join the Foreign Service, your job is to be apolitical and to implement, the policies of whatever administration you serve. And there are always times when you're going to have policies that you disagree with. But as I mentioned before, it's a very different issue if you believe that those policies, are counter to what we're trying to do. Some other examples of similar times are, with the Iraq War, you did have a number of resignations on principle, and they were people, and you can look back from today, and I think a lot of people would say that their objection was that we are going to get in a scenario where we are doing a lot of harm, not only to ourselves but to a lot of other people in the world, and that has turned out to be quite true. So, but it doesn't happen often. You had the same in the Vietnam War. You had a small number of people who did resign as well, because they did not want to implement policies towards an outcome that they thought was undermining our national interest. But by and large, and that's what I want to reiterate for people, is that the objections that I have, and the objections from a lot of people that you see commenting far more in newspapers and on news stations than you used to, particularly the folks who are career officers, it's not partisan. It's about our national security interests and what we're doing in the world. So, I would just say that by and large, the Foreign Service officers that I have known, they don't want to get in the spotlight. They don't want to be in the limelight. They want to do their jobs. And I think that, as we saw in, if you were watching some of the impeachment trials, in the fall, you had, high level career Foreign Service officers who testified. They waited to be subpoenaed. They didn't want to speak up because that was not what they felt their job was to be. But they did want to do that ultimately to serve the cause that they're serving in the Foreign Service for.
So I find it very interesting, as we have been doing this event, that there has been truly no real mention of partisanship politics in the US. And I don't know if people who are watching this could even pick out technically which side you vote on. And I would not have been surprised if people came in expecting a certain answer, but I don't know if I could peg you one way or the other. So to that, I congratulate you. You must have been a very excellent diplomat. We have a question here from Murad. What is your take on the tension between Egypt, Ethiopia, Sudan, and South Sudan regarding the building of a dam on Nile River?
That is it. Somebody is following those politics closely. It's a long time conflict over the Nile and the tremendous kind of power and life-giving source that it is. I think that I think that I mean, speaking generally speaking, not in the weeds, because I know this isn't a subject area specialty for, you know, most of the folks here, but war over water and power is going to be, you know, what the future is. War over natural resources, and the Nile has been for, you know, hundreds of years a source of tension. You know, and the idea of damming it, which makes a lot of sense if you're, you know, above that dam, but very little if you're below it, has been a source of great tension in the region. But without finding better sources of water, something like that could create a very big conflict in the region. So I think that's one of those areas that, you know, you're going to need regional intervention supported by folks on the outside, but you're going to need regional intervention and negotiations to make something like that not turn into a big conflict. But as water and other power resources and our natural resources become scarcer and scarcer, those are going to be the types of conflicts, potential conflicts, and battles that we're going to see going forward. It's just going to continue to increase. So one of the other flip sides of this interesting, strange pandemic world we're in is whether or not we do start learning to use fewer resources, bringing it back to the general. And I think that you know, if people in parts of the world that are really causing so much damage to our environment don't do as much of that, then it might not make it so much harder to negotiate and navigate issues such as, you know, your water and power resources in East Africa.
So we have a question. What was your best and your worst time in South Sudan?
That's a hard question. My worst time, that is a challenging question. I should probably have a good answer for this, but so much of it was just a combination of great moments, but you know, terrible ones. I mean, living through the first days of the war were really quite horrifying. Managing and dealing with, you know, kind of phone calls from American citizens who were stranded in areas that were under fire, where they were under siege and had lost, you know, had no more food or water access and weren't sure if they were going to survive. It's a horrifying thing to be on the phone with somebody and be like, you're 200 miles away. I can't do anything for you right now. Those were horrible moments. Talking to, you know, friends and contacts of mine who I could not help was just this incredibly, it was just heart-wrenching. But then, you know, on the flip side, on those exact same days, I would be able to help someone out of danger. I would be able to help someone with, you know, 6 kids get on a plane and get to a safer place when they've, you know, lost family members already. So those days were full of ups and downs. I will say my biggest disappointment overall was, and if I could pin it down to a single moment, actually, I spent about 3 weeks myself evacuated to Uganda. I took that time to meet with a lot of exiled South Sudanese, and I was doing my best to document the ethnic cleansing that had been going on. I met with, I don't know, well over 100 kind of survivors and victims and people who had experienced it to document this. And my thought was, if I can document what was happening and I can send this back to Washington, then we will do something to make a difference. And I remember, and there's a passage in the book on this, I had gotten a message from a relatively high-level person in the government, back in the State Department, who wanted to talk to me about some of the reporting I'd done. And I can remember exactly where I was sitting. And I remember I answered the phone. She was high level for me. I was a junior officer. She was a deputy assistant secretary. And, you know, she calls me up and I just launch into, you know, here's the resources we need to document it. Here's what we can do. We need to, you know, block access to this. We need to start tracking the human rights offenses. We need to start building accountability. And after I kind of paused for a moment, she said, she basically said, well, I'm not really sure what we're going to do, but at least you're there to bear witness. And it just ripped my heart out to realize we weren't going to do anything about it. We were going to continue to try and negotiate between the offending parties, but we weren't going to call anybody out. for specific crimes that led to, 10,000 plus deaths in a very short period of time. Not through, just some mishap, but very intentional slaughter. And that was the moment when I just thought, what am I out here doing this all for? When will this matter? If it doesn't matter now, when will it matter? And I remember hearing, I don't know, it might have been a year later, hearing Secretary of State John Kerry discuss how they hadn't known in the early days what exactly was happening. I forget his exact quote, so I apologize, but I remember hearing that and saying, you knew because I sent the report myself firsthand. And to hear that as the excuse later on for why we didn't act sooner was really remarkable to me. So that's a long answer, but that was my most disappointing moment.
Well, people obviously in America are not, as a rule, overly familiar with South Sudan. Do you have any things about South Sudan that you think people should know about? Did you have any favorite things? Did you have a favorite food that you liked there, or do the sunsets take your breath away? Or what are some things about the people that you'd like Americans to know?
I was always just amazed by the kind of tenacity and endurance of the South Sudanese people and their amazing ability for hope after everything that has happened in that country. So much strife that's been caused by, frankly, a small handful of leaders who have been leading the country through very, very dangerous times for many decades. It's not a big circle, as is the case in a lot of places. All the same players come up over and over again. And these are the same players who were battling each other in the 90s, and who are still the ones fighting each other today. So the idea that they continue to have hope and continue to look for, for optimism in their future, for me, is really remarkable. And, I'll say, I don't know if it's like the dustiness in the dry season, but yeah, Juba had some beautiful sunsets. It was and the Nile is this remarkable thing to see. And, in a place where it really is life-giving and everyone relies on it. It is a source of transportation. It is a source of sustenance. It is a source of escape. I knew people who had escaped, in Juba from, rows where they were just shooting everyone down, execution style, by, sprinting and diving into the river where they stayed for days. I mean, it is they say, a lot of my South Sudanese friends, would always say, you drink from the Nile and you're destined to come back. And there is something magical about that place. And I hope to get back there sometime in a slightly more optimistic time for the country.
So I think we have time for one more question here, and then we will wrap up. So our question is, had you been on another continent, would you still have resigned?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that, because I might have been in a place where I felt I could do more good things. There are friends of mine who continue to do good and important work, mostly in places that stay under the radar. When I resigned, I was actually working with the U.S. mission to Somalia at that time. And in Somalia, the airstrikes by the U.S. military had really ramped up, and have continued to ramp up since that time. So I was in a place where we had really few resources, where the diplomats really didn't have the lead, and where the military, our U.S. military, was, had the same goals in mind. They really wanted the, kind of stability and security, and to combat the terrorism activity in Somalia. But I had deep, deep fears that what we were doing was just making the terrorism problem worse and really endangering lives. And that was, one of many reasons I left. But that was one of the reasons that, it was a lot of the activity. It was a lot of the language of the administration, its approach to human rights, its approach to the Muslim ban, which was really damaging. But had I been in a different location where I thought I could do more good, I might not have resigned at the time that I did.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us this evening. If you would like a copy of the Dissent channel, it is available from Gibson's Bookstore. We're very pleased to have you here tonight. We look forward to seeing what happens next. And I guess that's it. I guess this will be going on YouTube later, so I guess like, subscribe, and comment. Is that a thing the kids say these days on our channel? And please do, if you think you know somebody who would have enjoyed this program when we put it up on YouTube, please do send it along. We would love to get this book out there further. Thank you very much for joining me tonight, and everybody have a great night.
Thank you all.